Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the second online lecture. In this lecture, we are going to finalize chapter 5. We're going to discuss important concepts in the theory of the consumer, like the paradox of value, as we will see, the consumer surplus, and we will revise some concepts related to elasticity. So we will start with the paradox of value. If you know Adam Smith, the father of economics, he was confused very much in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, which he wrote 200 years ago. He was confused by this idea that water, which is essential to life, where no one can live without it, has very little value. Actually, we can just open the water tap and drink water free of charge, while diamonds, which are not that important and not that essential, are so expensive. So this was the paradox of value that confused Adam Smith a lot. So can you think of what could be the driving force behind this? Why is water, although very important to every one of us, no one can live without it, has very little value? Sometimes we can even get it free of charge. And even if we buy it, it will be for very little money. We can buy a bottle of water for just 2 or 3 pounds. Okay, although water is really essential for every one of us and we cannot live without it. While diamonds, which are not that important, many of us can live without wearing a diamond ring. So despite that, diamonds are not that important, they are extremely expensive. So can you think of what is the driving force behind this paradox? The answer to this paradox lies in the scarcity of diamonds versus the abundance of water. So diamonds are very scarce and the cost of getting extra ones is very high. While water is abundant, it is an abundant resource and costs little in many areas of the world to get it. So this idea of abundance versus scarcity, does it ring any bells for you? Do you remember the relationship between scarcity of resources and the marginal utility of a resource? Do you recall the law of diminishing marginal utility? So if you remember the law of diminishing marginal utility, the more we have of a good, the more we have of a commodity, the lower the marginal utility we get from this commodity. The same applies for water. Since water is abundant, which means that it exists in very large amounts, the marginal utility we will be getting from the last glass of water that we drink or the last drop of water will be very low because of its abundance. So it is actually the large quantity of water that pulls the marginal utility so far down and thus reduces the price of this vital and extremely important commodity. Actually, the price of water is not determined by the total utility we get from water consumption. Rather, water's price is determined by its marginal utility. As we will see later, maybe when we discuss the idea of consumer surplus, we will see that the demand curve represents the marginal utility that the consumer is getting from a good. And it is this demand curve or the marginal utility that determines the goods price. So the same for water. It is the marginal utility of the last drop of water that we consume that determines its price, not the total utility we get from water consumption. And since water is abundant, this marginal utility will keep decreasing, okay, until we find out that the last drop of water we do not use for drinking, but we can even pour it into a flour, for example. So even though the first few drops of water are worth life, the last few are needed only for washing the car or for planting a flower. So now we are going to move to another important concept in the theory of the consumer, which is the consumer surplus. أو بالعربي هو فائض المستهلك. So what does consumer surplus mean? بالبلدي كده يعني إيه فائض المستهلك؟ يعني هل المستهلك عمل فائض؟ Yes. So sometimes you feel that when you purchase a certain good that you paid a price, however the value that you're getting from this good is much higher than the price you have paid. In this case you have achieved what we call consumer surplus أو فائض المستهلك. So let's look at the graph in front of us. This is a graph where we have price of water on the y-axis. So we'll have the price, and at the same time the y-axis will measure the marginal utility that the consumer will be getting from each quantity he consumes from water. On the x-axis we are going to have the quantity of water bottles consumed. Okay, so as you can see, the demand curve in this example, what does it show us? It shows us the following, that if the consumer wants to consume or to purchase one bottle of water, how much will he be willing to pay as a price? Let's imagine that we have one bottle of water on the x-axis. Okay, so we go up until we reach the demand curve of the consumer, and we find that the consumer will be willing to pay £8 for this first bottle of water. What does this willingness to pay mean? It means that definitely the consumer is getting a marginal utility from this first bottle of water equal to 8. Otherwise, he will never be willing to pay 8 for it. If he is getting a marginal utility of 7, for example, he will never say that I'm willing to pay 8. So here, the marginal utility that the consumer will be getting from water is revealed in his willingness to pay. And this is the information we get from the demand curve. That's why I said in the previous slide that the demand curve will be showing us the marginal utility that the consumer will be getting from each unit that he consumes from a good. Okay, so back to the graph. If the consumer wants to purchase or consume 2 bottles of water, so how much will he be willing to pay? Again, we will move from quantity equal to up to the demand curve, and we will find that the consumer will be willing to pay 7. This means that for the second bottle of water, the consumer will be getting a marginal utility of 7. This is revealed in his willingness to pay £7 for it. If we move forward again, 3 bottles of water, how much will he be willing to pay for it? We move from quantity equal 3 until we reach the demand curve, and we move to the left to see the price, and we find that for 3 bottles of water the consumer will be willing to pay 6. This means that the marginal utility he is getting from the third bottle of water is 6. So as you can see, the more bottles of water the consumer is consuming, the lower his willingness to pay. Why? Because of the law of diminishing marginal utility. The more bottles of water he consumes, the lower the marginal utility he will be getting, and this is revealed in lower willingness to pay. Okay, so what does this imply for our consumer surplus? As we said, consumer surplus is the surplus the consumer is getting from consuming a certain amount of a good. So how can we calculate this consumer surplus? It is calculated as follows. It is the area below the demand curve and above the market price of the good. What does this mean again? Consumer surplus, from the graph, it is this gray triangle, okay, which falls in the region below the demand curve of the consumer and above the market price. Why? Why do we have the consumer surplus as this area? What does the demand curve in this case represent? Actually, again, the demand curve shows the marginal utility a consumer will be getting from each unit that he consumes of the good, as we just explained. This implies that the consumer surplus will be the gap between the total utility of a good and its total market value. Again, why is that? So if we look again at this gray triangle, what is the market value of consuming m bottles of water? The market value will be m times the market price. And here we have the market price equal to £1. So the market value of consuming m bottles of water will be this small rectangle at the bottom, okay, which we can name O1 or ONEM. This small rectangle at the bottom, this is the market value of consuming m bottles of water. Okay, this is what we actually pay. Market value means that how much we actually pay, okay, to get m bottles of water. So what we will be paying is m times this £1, which will make up this small rectangle at the bottom, ONEM. Okay. However, there is a total utility that we are getting as consumers from consuming m bottles of water. How can we get this total utility? If you remember the lecture when we started talking about total utility and marginal utility, we said that the total utility that a consumer is getting from consuming a certain number of units of a good is equal to the summation of the marginal utility he is getting from each unit. The same applies here. The total utility that our consumer will be getting from consuming m units of or m bottles of water will be the summation of the marginal utility he will be getting from each unit, and the marginal utility will be represented by the demand curve. So the marginal utility of the first bottle of water, okay, will be equal to 8, for example. The marginal utility of the second bottle of water will be equal to 7. The marginal utility of the third bottle of water is 6, and so on and so forth. This means that the total utility that the consumer will be getting from consuming m bottles of water will be the area of the triangle OREM. Okay, so actually it's not a triangle, but it looks like a triangle, so it is the triangle, the gray triangle, plus the rectangle. What is this? This is the total utility that the consumer is getting from consuming m bottles of water. Okay, it is OREM. Okay, this is the total utility minus the market value, which is the rectangle ONEM. This makes up the consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus will be the area, the gray triangle, the area of the gray triangle, which is the difference between the total utility the consumer is getting from consuming a certain amount of the good minus the market value he is paying to purchase this amount of the good. Okay, so this is what we call consumer surplus or فائض المستهلك. So why does it arise in the first place? Why do we have this idea or this concept of consumer surplus? It arises for the following reasons. We know that we pay the same price for each unit we consume of the good. Okay, so we will be paying £1 for the first bottle of water that we purchase. We will be paying the same £1 for the second bottle of water that we will purchase. We will be paying the same price, which is 1 for any number of water bottles that we purchase. So because we pay the same price for each unit we consume of the good, despite the fact that we value each unit differently, as is clear from the demand curve, as is clear from our willingness to pay, as is clear from the marginal utility we are getting from each unit differently. If you recall, this is related to the law of diminishing marginal utility. So the first units are worth more to us than the last ones. Okay, so this is the reason, this is the main reason behind having a consumer surplus. It is because of the fact that we value each unit differently because of the law of diminishing marginal utility. However, we pay the same price for all the units. No matter how many units or how many bottles of water we purchase, we are going to pay the same price. However, we are sure deep inside that we value them differently. That's why there is this concept of consumer surplus, that we pay the price that is prevailing in the market. However, we know deep inside that we value the first unit much more. When we are fasting, for example, we are extremely thirsty and we are willing to pay like £100 for the first bottle of water. However, when we go to Geddu to buy a bottle of water, we just pay £2 or £3. Okay, so once we drink this bottle of water, we feel that we have achieved a consumer surplus. We have made a benefit that is much higher than what we paid for, because we were willing to pay actually much more for it than the market price that we paid at Geddu in the cafeteria at FEPS. Okay, so this is the idea of the consumer surplus. Do we have applications for it? Yes, of course. It is used in many applications, as we will see next. Okay, so hopefully you now understand the concept of consumer surplus or فائض المستهلك. What could be potential applications of this concept of consumer surplus? Okay, so this concept of consumer surplus is useful in helping evaluate many government projects and decisions. For instance, the economic advisors to the government, هم المستشارين الاقتصاديين للحكومة, usually use this concept of consumer surplus to determine the costs and benefits of government projects. Let's think of a recent example of Juhayna Square Bridge in 6th of October city. If some of you has been to this area before, منطقة 6 أكتوبر عند ميدان جهينة, this had horrible traffic for a long time, and people used to stay in cars for like 15 to 20 minutes every day in the rush hour. So the government was thinking of building a new bridge in this area in order to overcome this high traffic. So the Ministry of Housing, وزارة الإسكان, before deciding on whether to build this bridge or not, it has to do a cost-benefit analysis. And its economic advisors are the ones who usually do this task, and they usually use the concept of consumer surplus in order to determine the benefits of any government project. Okay, so back to this example of the bridge in Johanna Square on 6th of October. Of course, this bridge will bring no revenue to the government because cars cross this bridge without paying any money. So it is free of charge. It will thus bring no revenue to the government. So what will be the benefit that will accrue to the government from building this bridge? Actually, the benefit will be in the value to the users of this bridge, which will be in the amount of money, in the amount of time saved by the users of this bridge. And it can be measured by the individual consumer surplus for all users of this bridge. So if we assume that there are 10,000 users of this Johanna Square bridge, and each individual's consumer surplus is, for example, $350 for the bridge. Okay, so the bridge will raise economic welfare if its total cost is less than 3.5 million. What is this $3.5 million? It is the 10,000 users times $350 in the form of consumer surplus per user, which will make up $3.5 million. Okay, so this is the benefit that will go to the users of the bridge if it was built. And every consumer of this bridge has calculated this surplus in the form of the time that will be saved if this bridge will be built. Okay, so this will be the benefit from building the bridge. So if the cost of building the bridge is less than this $3.5 million, the government should directly go ahead and build this bridge, because doing a cost-benefit analysis, it seems that the benefit is higher than the cost, so the government should build it. If the cost is higher than the $3.5 million, it definitely should not build this bridge, and it should direct its funds to build some other bridge somewhere else where the benefit exceeds the costs. So this is an important application of the idea of consumer surplus, and it is used heavily in the area of public policies and evaluating different public projects. The remaining of chapter 5 is devoted to revising some of the concepts that we took before. That's why we're not going to spend a lot of time on them. First concept that we already took before, which is the concept of market demand. And we said that market demand is a horizontal summation of the individual demand curves. If we want to draw a market demand for any good, we just sum horizontally all the individual consumption demand for this good at each price. So the demand curve for a good for the entire market is obtained by summing up the quantities demanded by all the consumers at each market price. So we take each market price and then we horizontally sum the quantity demanded by each consumer, by each individual consumer at that price. And this summation, this horizontal summation, will give us the market demand curve for any good. The second idea that the chapter goes through is the idea of demand shifts, which we studied before. We know that changes in the price of a commodity affects the quantity demanded of that commodity, i.e. it causes movements along the demand curve. We also know that there are non-own price determinants of demand, okay, which are which are represented by a number of factors that cause shifts in the demand curve, okay? And these factors are anything but the commodity's own price. One of the most important factors that cause shifts in the demand curve is changes in the income level of the consumer. Here we have to differentiate between two types of commodities. We have either normal goods. These are goods where an increase in income tends to increase the amount we are willing to buy of these goods, i.e., an increase in income will result in a rightward shift in the demand for normal goods. However, the other type is inferior goods, which are goods of low quality. Here we find that an increase in income will cause a leftward shift in the demand for inferior goods. However, take care, because under normal goods we have two subcategories. Normal goods could be necessities or luxuries. So a normal good could be a necessity, which tends to be less responsive to income changes. This means that if income increases by 1 percentage point, the demand for necessities will increase by 0.5 percentage point. So there will be a rightward shift in the demand for necessities, but it will not be a big shift. However, if we are talking about luxury goods, they tend to be more responsive to income changes. So if the income increases by 1 percentage point, the demand for the luxury goods will increase by more than 1 percentage point. So the rightward shift will be very big. So here we are talking about the income elasticity of demand for normal goods. Whether it is a necessity or a luxurious good, we have to be very cautious about these two types. Another important factor that leads to shifts in the demand curve is the price changes of other goods. Here we have to differentiate between substitutes and complements. So everyone knows for sure that raising the price of beef will decrease the amount of beef demanded. This is movement along the demand curve for beef. We also know that it will also affect the demand for other commodities, like the demand for chicken, for example, because chicken is considered a substitute for beef. A higher price for beef will increase the demand for chicken. So a higher price for beef will result in a rightward shift in the demand curve for chicken. However, if we look at complements to beef, like ketchup and hamburger buns, we find that a higher price for beef will result in a lower demand for hamburger buns and ketchup that are used along with beef hamburgers. So this will result in a leftward shift in the demand curve for ketchup and a leftward shift in the demand curve for hamburger buns. It will probably have no effect on the demand for economics textbooks. So in some cases, goods are independent, مستقلين. They are independent from each other, which means that an increase in the price of beef, it will cause no effect on the demand curve for economics textbooks. In this case, we are talking about independent goods.